Hello everyone and welcome to my A10-A tips video. Specifically, this one is aimed for people looking to play on Enigma's Cold War server, but it should be applicable to other servers set in about the same time period, so mid-Cold War. Just like my F5 video that I put out previously, this isn't sort of a master level video, it's really aimed at sort of beginner tips. But at the same time, I am assuming that you have done the tutorial, and so I won't be going over sort of basics of startup or how to fly. If anyone is interested in a sort of high-level tips video or a low-level beginner sort of how to fly video, do just let me know in the comments. I'm happy to do either of those. But for now, let's jump straight to tip number 1. Okay, so let's start with perhaps the most important tip for new players, and that is do not overestimate the A10 survivability. Yes, this craft does have higher than average pilot survivability, but keyword there is pilots. It's designed to be able to take a hit and have the pilot able to eject to safety. It's not designed to be able to take a hit from a missile and still be combat capable. And yes, you can absolutely, on occasion, take a missile hit and still be in a good shape, but more often than not, when you get hit by a missile, a critical system, such as an engine or your avionics, gets broken. And just as often, a single missile hit will send you out of the sky, especially if it hits the wing. Wing damage is a killing blow to an A10. And it's also worth noting that even ground AA will absolutely shred you to pieces. A Shilka can absolutely devastate an A10 in a single burst if it gets a decent hit. So just remember, you are armoured somewhere between an attack helicopter and a fighter jet. You are not a tank. You still want to avoid incoming fire, or better yet, not be shot at all. So how do you go about not being shot at? Well, the main way is simply to stay low. If you have enemy fast movers on the map and you don't have enough fast movers of your own to give you really good air support, then stay as low as possible, hugging the tree line if you can. If the enemy is relying on the in-game AWACS or their own radar systems, then staying low can block you from that, so can really help you there. And even if the enemy is relying on the Overlord bot, which doesn't have any terrain masking, you can still get an advantage here because you are much harder to spot against the ground than you are against the sky. So ideally, stay low as possible at all times. The one exception to this is if the enemy doesn't have any fighter jets up, you can probably safely stay nice and high in order to get a better view over the combat zone. Otherwise, hug the trees, bother the squirrels. Also on the topic of staying alive, big tip is don't linger. Your job is to get to the front line, deliver your payload, and get back as quickly as you can. The longer you spend on the front line, the longer you're giving enemy MiGs a chance to intercept you and shoot you down. And yes, efficient use of your ordnance is a good thing for your team, but losing a plane is really not worth getting an extra truck destroyed. So it's better just to use your weapons quickly, get them off your rails, and get back to friendly territory, rather than sticking around to get that perfect final shot. Now, the Flaming Cliffs planes, A10-A included, do not have access to the Overlord bot, since they have all preset frequencies, so you can't tune in to the correct one. But this isn't too bad, you still have access to the in-game AWACS on the comms menu F7, and this is really quite a good system. It's even better if you've got a player GCI, in which case you are at absolutely no disadvantage. But even the default in-game AWACS isn't too bad. Just make sure you are listening to him, keeping an eye out for when those calls are coming, and on occasion just ask for a bogey dope just to get an idea of what's heading towards you. The disadvantage of the in-game AWACS as opposed to the Overlord bot is it does get affected by terrain masking, so it won't detect lone flying aircraft, but this is compensated for by the fact that it will pick up helicopters, which Overlord bot is set to ignore, so you can actually get a little bit more information out there. Now, even if you follow all of these tips, be very careful, have really good close air support right on you, you are still going to cross paths with a MiG-21 who is going to want to shoot you down. Important thing to remember when that does happen is that you are not helpless. The A10-A is actually quite a good anti-air platform on this server. You can get 2 AIM-9P5s, the same loadout that an F5 can carry. You're not fast, but you are incredibly maneuverable, and you can take a few cannon rounds and keep trucking. In all honesty, I get more air-to-air kills in the A10 than the F5, and this is especially helped by a lot of MiG pilots thinking that you are an easy target. Very much the same thing that happens with F5 pilots thinking of Frogfoot as an easy target and ending up with a nasty surprise. My favourite tactic is simply to go for the head-on. Your AIM-9P5s can get a decent lock in a head-on, and you have more than enough flares and chaff to simply spam them out for days, really making you very difficult for the enemy to get a decent lock on. So that's enough for survivability for now. Let's turn to what the A10-A is really about, and that's dealing damage to ground targets. The most important thing there is to pick a decent loadout, one that works for you. My favourite general loadout is to always take the 6 Mavericks, or 4 Mavericks if you're taking off from a road base. Mavericks are the A10's best weapon. And other than that, I do very much like just putting the remaining slots on cluster bombs, other than saving the single rack for the AIM-9s that you can carry. Part of this is those Rockeye cluster bombs are really good for this server. They can destroy most targets, and they're really easy to use. You just have to drop them vaguely near the enemy, and the cluster effect will take care of any small inaccuracy that you had. On top of that, there's a small bug. I don't know if it's been fixed or not since I haven't seen it for a few days, but there certainly was a bug in which if you had more than 2 weapons or ground attack weapons as selected, you could only select between 2 of them at a time. There were various ways to get around this, including rebooting electrical systems, or going to air-to-air mode and back to air-to-ground mode, but those didn't always work for me, so I ended up just taking 2 weapons just to make sure that I'd always have access to those Mavericks. Now, certainly I wouldn't say keep to this religiously. This is just a good beginner loadout. Play around, find what weapons work for you, but for me, I really like my 6x Mavericks and just a whole load of Rockeyes. As I said, the Mavericks are the A10's best weapon, and so you really want to use those to maximum effect. And what they are best at is taking out AAA before going in with the rest of your weapons. So pretty much every ground spawn that there is on this server is defended by Shilkas, and those are your primary target. They are normally located at the corner of bases. You'll see them spaced out a bit from the rest, and if you zoom in with the Mavericks display, you can sometimes make out the shape of that Shilka with the AAA gun pods sitting on the top of it. It's very different from the shape of a tank, even at range. And since you've got 6 Mavericks, that is more than enough to take out all Shilkas in any group, and leaves you with enough that it doesn't matter if you accidentally target a compound or a truck or a T-72 by mistake, you'll still end up taking out those Shilkas. Now, the Mavericks are awesome weapons, but like all weapons, they do have their limits. One thing to bear in mind with the Maverick is if you're launching it at near its max range, it isn't really the fastest weapon. It does bleed off speed rather quickly once the rocket has exhausted itself, and this leads to the A10 actually catching it up during the second half of its flight. Practically what this means is if you launch Mavericks at something like a Shilka, you can't be sure that the Maverick will actually hit the Shilka before you enter weapons range, so never follow the Maverick straight in. Always launch your Mavericks and then turn to evade, go around for another pass. That gives your Maverick time to take out the air defenses, and then you can go in for your bombs run. You may have noticed that so far I've missed out the A10's headline weapon of the GAU-8, and that is because just behind its survivability, the GAU-8 is the next most overblown part of this aircraft. Now, don't get me wrong, can already see the hate coming in the comments. The GAU-8 is a very good weapon, but it is not the laser beam of death it's so often portrayed as. It will destroy a lot. Against light targets, a single hit on or anywhere near the target will absolutely take it out. And even against hardened targets like tanks, the GAU-8 is perfectly capable. On the server, you can take out any of the tanks that spawn with a good sort of 1 second burst straight to the side. The thing to be careful of, though, is in order to get those shots off, you need to be at relatively close range, and you probably need to be flying in a pretty straight line, which means you are very vulnerable to return fire. So absolutely do not use the GAU-8 as your initial weapon on going in. You never want to be using this if there is a Shilka anywhere in the area. What the GAU-8 is amazing at is cleaning up after an attack. After you've used your Mavericks to take out the enemy air defense, after you've dropped your cluster bombs or whatever other munitions you fancy using to take out the bulk of the enemy targets, you can then go in with the GAU-8 and pick off any stragglers, and it really will wipe out a remains of a base. You have plenty of ammunition as long as you fire in short bursts, and so whether it's an outpost that you're going in on or one of the tank groups, you can just make pass after pass, taking out truck after truck, vehicle after vehicle, and really not worrying too much. Do just remember that you are vulnerable during this point, and remember my earlier tips that you are not immortal and you don't really want to be lingering too long. So do keep in mind when it's time to bug out of the area, and always keep an eye out for any other AAA threats that are nearby. And lastly, I just want to cover one role of the A10 that's normally overlooked. So yes, it is mostly a ground attack aircraft. However, building from the tips that we've seen so far, it is a surprisingly good helicopter hunter. So the fact that you're forced to use the in-game AWACS means that you normally are able to be vectored in on nearby Hinds. A lot of Hind players I've seen don't seem to really realise this. I've had people getting angry at me, accusing me of cheating with F11 screens, when all I've been doing is following the in-game AWACS's call-outs that there is a contact 5 miles away at 500 meters, and I've just followed it in from there. On top of that, the fact that you are very, very slow, at least compared to all the jets out there, means that you do have time both to spot the enemy helicopter and to take your time to get a missile or a gun solution. Your survivability does actually come in handy here, since you can tank a few rounds of the Hinds autocannon if it does decide to turn and fight you, and you really do have enough offensive firepower to take on those targets. The AIM-9P will normally score a single hit kill against a Hind, especially if you fire it slightly from above, so that the missile detonates in the enemy's rotor. The Hind can take quite a beating on its fuselage, but if you knock off 1 or 2 of the rotor blades, it's going down no matter what. And that GAU-8 of yours, again, even though it's not the most accurate gun, you don't really need it to be accurate, you just need to spray a lot of shots, And the fact that helicopters are virtually stationary means it's quite easy to get some hits in. And again, it doesn't take that many hits of the rotor blade to take out or at least cripple a hind. Well, there you have it, my 10 tips for beginners in the A10-A. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, do consider leaving a like. This list certainly wasn't expansive, it wasn't complete, so if you have your own tips, please do leave them below. Had some really nice tips on the F5 video I did previously, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what you all have, what your top tips are. If you would like to see more of this kind of content going forward, do consider subscribing to the channel, and otherwise, until I see you next time, remember, take care. Cheers.